Hey everyone, welcome back to week 2 of the very first month of my Patreon page. Today we're going to be talking about our very first bass line. And like last week, I just want to start with like the real essential fundamental concept of how to play a bluegrass bass line. There's a couple different things that are a part of that. One of which is muting your notes, like where to mute them. And the other one is actually talking about the transition notes, the notes going from chord to chord. So you want to kind of play something a little different going from chord to chord than you would in a standard bass line when you're vamping on a chord. So first thing I want to talk about is this muting technique. So the most important thing here is you're kind of working in tandem with your mandolin player, right? So the mandolin player is playing those backbeats, beats 2 and 4. We're playing beats 1 and 3. And when the mandolin hits 2 and 4 on the chop, we want to mute our note. So there's this kind of playing off of one another that's happening like pretty much all the time. And it's a really essential part of the bluegrass groove, in my opinion. So let me just play quickly. I'll do my open G string, open D string, and I won't mute anything. And then I'll flip into this muting technique. I'll be using my left hand to mute, which means my entire hand is coming down over all 4 strings. And when it's not muting, you don't want it to fly like this. You just let it hover a little bit above the strings. This goes back to that economy of motion concept we talked about last week. You don't want to, have your hand fly off the fingerboard if it doesn't need to, right? So first I'll play it again. No muting, and then I'll add the mutes in, and you'll almost be able to hear that mandolin chop when I mute the note. That's the idea. You want to be able to kind of feel the groove of the bass line without any other instrument present. So first things first, just do this. Right, sounds pretty good, but it's a little bit, doesn't really have a driving sound necessarily. Check this out. There's that bounce we want in our bass line, And it's like you can almost hear that mandolin chop every time I mute. Back to the original. It works for a certain context, but most of bluegrass, it's a little bit too long. Oh yeah. So that's the concept with muting. And not every note is going to be an open string like we just played. You got your G and D strings, but sometimes you'll play a closed note. And on a closed note, I still want to use the left hand to mute. So what you'll do is you'll just pick whatever finger that you're playing with up off the string. It does not have to fly off the string. It can just lightly release pressure. So it can still stay on the string, but at the same time, it is still close and accessible for the next note. So like, for example, we'll be using the C on the A string, this note, in this bass line, and we're going to be playing it with our second finger. So that being said, if you want to release pressure and get a mute, just take that finger off. And you'll try your best to eliminate any string noise, Ideally, it's silent. It's hard to get it fully silent, but with the rest of a band and everything, that kind of thing gets covered up. It's not like too extreme or anything like that. Before we get into the actual bass line, another thing I want to cover is if you wanted to practice this kind of thing with a metronome, I really recommend putting the metronome on beats 2 and 4, kind of like a mandolin. I've done this with some of my students. And for some people, it's harder than others. It's something that could be effortless for people who've been playing for a long time, people who are used to bluegrass music. For other people, it might be a little bit daunting and confusing at first. Let me just demonstrate that really quickly. I got my metronome here. I want to put it down at like maybe 100 beats per minute. Cool, so the metronome is at 100 beats per minute. And usually when you're playing with a metronome, you'd play it on the same beat, right? It would be hitting all the ones that you're hitting. But here, I want to do this. Oh, all of a sudden we got a groove going on. That metronome is acting as our mandolin. It's really fun to play along to, and it'll really get your muting in a really consistent space. So some of you may have recognized that bass line. Of course, that's like, over probably 100 songs have that progression. That's like the Bluegrass #1 progression, which is why I wanted to use it today. We're covering On My Way Back to the Old Home in the key of G. So just like, this is bread and butter bluegrass stuff. For people who haven't played a lot of bluegrass, this is like #1 song to know. If you don't know a recording of it, check out the Bluegrass album band version. They're actually playing it in B flat, which is a little bit higher, a little bit more challenging on the bass. So I took it down to G, which is a key you'll hear a lot in a jam setting. A lot of people sing it in G. So it will be really useful, when you're when all this is over and we can go jam again. So we have our muting down, right? Just to review, when it's open string, our left hand, we don't want it to fly off the fingerboard, but you just let it hover slightly and come down on the strings lightly. And we're going to be playing that C on the A string. That's our one closed note in this bass line. You just let that string, or you just let that finger lift up a little bit. That's all. So, without further ado, on my way back to the old home. So, I think what I hear a lot of people do with this is you just play that root and fifth back and forth, and there's not it's not like you can't really hear those transitions clearly when you're doing that. And you'll run into some kind of awkward moments in your bass line. So listen to this really quickly and see if you can hear what I mean when I say like these transitions feel a little awkward or there's just some notes that don't fit. So the problems that I have there are when the fifth of one chord is the same as the root of the next. I kind of call that like an awkward fifth to root transition. So for example, let's say you're on that C chord, right? And you're going back to G. That fifth is the same note as the root of the G chord, right? Fifth of the C chord is a G, and the root of the G chord is a G. So it kind of has this weird, it just feels like you're getting tripped up or something. I just don't like that sound. There's no intrigue or like suspense, right? It's just like, oh yeah, we're going to play this note, then we'll just play it again. It feels a little lackluster. So what I recommend doing, really this is the first thing you want to do with any song you're learning on a bass line. Repeat that root note before you go to the next chord. It's such a great way to just get a really solid sound and, have a different thing happen in that transition period before you get into the next chord. It's like an essential way to build a really strong bass line. So listen to that same bass line again. I'll repeat all those roots and hear how the structure of it feels a lot more solid. All of a sudden, we got a really strong bass line with transition notes that are different than the note you're playing in your normal bass line, and kind of guiding the band and the listener to the next chord. So let me just A-B those one more time, and you can hear the difference now that we've heard both. Let's do them back to back. And you know what? I'll put the metronome on too and do that so you can hear it all at once. All right. 100 beats per minute. We're rocking with this metronome. Here we go. Here's the repeated roots. Oh yeah. So what I'd recommend doing if you want a little homework assignment for this week, pick a song you like playing along to. You know, something grassy or folky, something with like this kind of two feel, whether you're playing beats 1 and 3, and just play through the song with repeated roots the entire way through. It's, you know, after a while, it does end up sounding a little robotic and a little bit monotonous. It's not something that, you know, long-term we're going to be doing all the time. But to me, this is like the number one way to start playing a bass line. If you want to start, you know, you can use the fifths note to transition to other chords. You know, like, for example, going from G to C, that fifth works really nicely. That D note going down to the C, because there's a good melodic motion. Like, we'll talk about that in weeks going forward. There's different ways to transition from chord to chord. But if you can just get down that muting technique, mute the note halfway through, and repeated roots all the way through, you're golden. Like, honestly, no one's going to say anything to you in the jam or on stage. They're going to be like, oh, wow, you're a great bass player, you know? That's the, you know, if people don't notice you, you're doing great. That's the classic thing about being a bass player, you know? So we'll figure out ways to spice up our lines that feel like they support the song instead of getting in the way. And we'll get there in other weeks. But pick a song you like, mute the note halfway through, and repeated root from chord to chord. And that would be a great assignment for you this week. So thanks so much again, everyone. This is my first week of, you know, being out there. And I think I'm already at like 13 patrons now, which means a lot to me. My goal was 20 for the end of this month. So if you have any other bass playing friends or anything, please let them know. You know, I would love to get to 20 by the end of January, if not more than that. But I feel really glad that I did this. I feel like it's unique. I don't know anyone else who's doing this thing on Patreon. So it means a lot that you all showed up. And I'll see you next week. Thanks so much.